Good afternoon, everyone. This is the last session of the day, so it is actually really great to see so many of you making it till the end. Thank you for being here. My name is Jehan. I am from the UNDP Malaysia office, and I'm here with my great panelists, who I'll introduce one by one, and then we'll just jump into the questions. So on my right, we have Sarayu Natarajan, who is the founder of UPTI Institute, and Sarayu works on equity and justice at the intersection of technology and society in India. Your research and practice has focused on digital infrastructure, citizenship and inclusion, and governance of technologies. And just to plug a report that was done by Sarayu's team in 2022 on this intersection between AI and human rights. Also to my right, we have Ben Hardman, who is the Mekong Legal Director at Earth Rights International. You work to support communities affected by issues at the intersection of environment and human rights, including in extractives and land grabs for development projects. Big stuff. To my left, I have Ai Natasha, who kindly asked the question earlier, quite pertinent for our session as well, who is the founder of the Enable Project, a green startup that champions the circular economy by turning food waste into valuable resources. Ai is also the chairperson at Gerbang Tara, correct? A foundation focused on sustainable development with a special emphasis on supporting indigenous communities in East Kalimantan. And to my far left, we have Pacharibun Mam Sakul Pitakpon, who is the Sustainability and Impact Lead at Palo IT Thailand, a global tech consultancy that designs, develops, and scales digital and sustainable products and services. Welcome to all of you. So today's session was of particular interest to me as it tries to marry the new and in many ways unknown with tradition and custom. Historically, the use of technologies has been a key driver of poverty reduction and has raised the living standards for millions of people in a very short amount of time. And technology continues to excite us. AI and advanced analytics have the potential to help us tackle some of our most challenging problems. AI climate tools, for example, are already in use. Researchers at the University of Leeds developed an AI tool that can map icebergs 10,000 times faster than humans. Another AI software is being used in the US to help some of the biggest carbon emitters, particularly in oil and gas, to decarbonize by tracking and reducing their emissions by 20 or to 30%. But of course, we know that this comes at a cost. As we see more investments in new technologies, we must also ensure that we don't overlook how these technologies are made possible in the first place. In this session, we hope to unpack the environmental impacts of new tech on rights, investigate the deep connections between technology-driven supply chains and the harms on indigenous communities and ecosystems. And of course, we want to learn how businesses can navigate these intersections. I will start with you, Sarayu. So we are now seeing the rapid destabilization and erasure of indigenous cultures and ecosystems as a result of mining, construction, and other related developments to meet these technological demands. Could you start us off by sharing in what material ways indigenous communities are being harmed in this process?
Thank you very much for that question. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with my co-panelists and in this room, having this conversation about the impacts of AI on several aspects of human rights, but specifically on the question of the environment. I think to break down the question of materiality, I would like to think of the two parts to the AI value chain, so to speak. The first part being the making of AI and the expectations it has of people, of the environment, as well as the use of AI, which is basically running any kind of inference models in order to get outputs from AI. And then talk a little bit about why AI is unique, why we need to pay attention and problematize it, I dare say, a little bit differently. And I think then start to come to the question of the intersection with indigenous communities. Just thinking about the making of AI, and its link to materiality. AI involves the use of hardware, which needs silicon. So there is a resource expectation or a resource use that the making of AI requires. Model development requires the transmission of models and data across different server systems, and hence there is a need for materials like copper or aluminum. There are some rare minerals as well that are used in different components of the AI hardware system. And then, of course, in running models, there's a need for cooling and land for data centers. So there's enormous resources, material resources, but of different sorts. And then, of course, the use of AI itself, which is running an inference model, typically in the context of generative AI, also requires hardware, it requires more data, it also requires cooling because these data centers are churning. And there are, depending on where you look and which website you ask, and if you can ask generative AI itself, there are several analogies of what running a chat query would look like. Some people argue that the energy used by OpenAI and the various instances of ChatGPT is like charging 3 million electric vehicles. It is the equivalent of running 25,000 households in the US. I mean, there are several analogies, but I think the broader point being that it's fairly energy intensive, both in the making and the use of AI. Why do we need to pay attention to AI? For many years, I've thought that AI is not exceptional. It's very much like any other technology, but increasingly, particularly with the advent of generative AI, I've begun to wonder whether we need to think about it slightly differently than we do, and do we need an exceptional approach? I think there are a few reasons. The first being that AI has tremendous use for various stakeholders. It can play a big role in democratizing access to technical systems. It can play a big role in bringing in persons with disabilities, for example, in participating in the progress of technology. It inheres in it various conflicts. The second is that there is a geopolitical question at play in the context of AI, which is that AI is made in one part of the world, often relying on labor and resources in another part of the world. And so there is a jurisdiction enforcement question in the context of AI. The third one is trickier, and I think in some ways, maybe something to consider in thinking about AI as its own sort of curious thing, is that the making and the use are sometimes separated, which is that an entity makes it, but we are users of AI. In running a search now, it's bundled in the context of Google. I don't know how many people have seen, but you get a generative AI output each time you run a search on Google. And that's fairly intensive and stacked up over millions and billions of searches and millions and billions of use cases. You have extensive energy consumption, but that is different from the making of AI. And so there are questions of how do you distribute accountability and responsibility? What does it even mean? And so I think that thinking about AI as an exceptional question is sort of the second order of things to think about. And the third is the intersection with indigenous communities. I think nobody in this hall needs to be told what these intersections are, but there are, of course, claims on land. There are claims on water. There are claims on forests. So there is a huge claim on natural resources. Even the processes that are used in the making and the use of AI often have significant health consequences for communities that are near some of these places, where data centers are, for example. The one thing, though, that underlies this, and I think some of the panelists in the earlier sessions, at least in this room, have alluded to, is the question of criminalizing advocates for the environment or advocates for human rights. And so in very many parts of the world, there is an oppositional framing of indigenous communities' rights, or more broadly human rights, and the progress of AI and innovation. And this oppositional framing is also at the heart of why perhaps we need to think about AI differently. But I'll hand back to you, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Sarayu. Thanks also for reinforcing that exceptional challenges really forces us to think about exceptional solutions. And so also I've just written down oppositional framing. That's great. So just staying on this thread, with the global demand for rare minerals and other raw materials in Asia, the extractive sector is inherently exposed to rights violations. Yet support to rights holders, whether financial, legal, or through remedies, remains elusive and severely lacking. Ben, could you share with us from your work with communities, what are some emerging human rights risks and how these communities are dealing with them?
Thank you. Yeah, I think what's interesting is that despite things like AI, electric vehicles, robotics all being very new, a lot of the problems are very much the same. I think particularly for issues around rare earths, we're still seeing very direct impacts on communities from things like extractives. To give you a bit of context, heavy rare earths in particular are used in magnets. And magnets are, at the moment, 2020, around 30% of demand came from electronics. By 2030, that demand is going to increase by 300%, with most of that being electric vehicles, about a third, and another third being wind turbines. It'll double again by 2050. So these are huge increases in demand for heavy rare earths. At the moment, the rare earths that are used in magnets include dysprosium and terbium. Two-thirds of the global supply is coming from one small part of one state of Myanmar. It's coming from one small part of Kachin state in northeast Myanmar, which was until last year an area controlled by a warlord aligned to the Myanmar military. And so there is this link. And perhaps to tie in a bit more with AI is the idea that the energy use there is huge. It's already perhaps 2% of global consumption. By 2026, some forecasts say it'll double to 4%, so the same as Japan. To put it in another context, 2% is roughly the same as the entire aviation industry. And so what is this mining like in Myanmar? It's called in situ mining. What that means is you drill holes into the top of the mountainside and pour in chemicals like ammonium sulfate. That releases the things that you want, the dysprosium or terbium, and everything else that you don't want. So heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, selenium, all kinds of ions. And so the impacts downstream on communities, and these are indigenous communities in Kachin, are things like complete loss of biodiversity, health impacts, increased miscarriages, deaths of workers, both from the chemicals and also from landslides. And how does this fit into global supply chains? Well, it's relatively opaque. You have companies in Myanmar that are Chinese-backed or Chinese-owned, exporting entirely into China, where it goes to a large state-owned enterprise, the China Rare Earth Group, which does all the processing, and then it goes to magnet manufacturers also in China before it enters global supply chains for wind turbines and EVs, etc. Now, the downstream companies are aware of this, both because of their own human rights due diligence, but also because of CSOs raising it, and just like Global Witness. And so companies know that their rare earths are almost certainly coming from Myanmar. And so it's effectively baked into their business model. Now, how have communities responded? It's been extremely challenging. Up until last year, the area was controlled by a militia linked to the military. Conflict has now seen that change to the control of an ethnic armed group, the Kachin Independence Organization, that is substantially more, I would say, democratic, but also has policies that protect indigenous rights. Obviously, it's fighting a war, and to the extent to which those are implemented is questionable. And so communities in these areas have protested. That's been the main way they've stopped new mines. They're now working, or there's a big role for CSOs, a lot of making sure that communities have access to information, so water testing, monitoring documentation, talking about responsible mining, so that communities can decide whether or not they want to oppose new mining in their areas. Also advocacy with both local stakeholders now, being the Kachin Independence Organization, and also communities and CSOs are doing advocacy directly with bodies like the OECD and car companies in Europe. But obviously, we're still a very long way from anything that you could even begin to compare to any kind of free, prior, and informed consent. And remedy is more or less impossible at the moment. I think just very quickly, there is, to give a more positive example, you can see in Thailand. Thailand has EIA laws that are progressive, that you can enforce in the courts. You are seeing communities carry out community-led health impact assessments where they are then able to, in the courts, challenge projects. And so, for example, before the harm happens, communities in Omkhoi in northern Thailand have managed to use EIA laws to stop projects before they happen because of a failure to follow EIA laws. So it's not, I think within the region there's a huge variance, but I think particularly rare earths in Myanmar is absurdly harmful for communities.
Are we asking then for companies to go beyond EIA, proper EIA, meaningful EIA?
Well, I think in Myanmar there is no such thing as EIA, right? Yeah. Prior to the coup, there were some laws that put in place EIA, but a real lack of enforcement. And mining has been taking place in areas that haven't been in central government control for the last 70 years.
Thanks, Ben. Moving on to Ali. And so I want to bring in the business aspect. BHR actors have been grappling with these consequences to ensure that there's greater accountability from businesses for their human rights violations, and also given uneven commitments from industry to prevent environmental rights catastrophes. What does this mean for a region like Asia, a key player in the global tech industry and the tech supply chain, but also home to millions of people, including a large demographic of young indigenous people who may bear some of the worst impacts of the technological race to the top?
Thank you for the questions. I think it's a very familiar thing for all of us when we talk about technology advancement. So I'm talking about how technology and also business and society can come together. I've been living my life for almost 3 decades, and half of them I dedicate to social and environmental issues, where I do volunteer to actually know what is being discussed in government sector, in business sector, as well as us representing the community. When talking about the technological race to the top in Asia, we do believe that it presents a complex dynamic of both opportunity and challenges. And as a key player in the global supply chain, home to millions of people, we cannot deny that we may bear the brunt of these changes, facing disruptions, inequality, and also the environmental challenges. And thanks to the technology that today I'm representing not only Indonesian and the indigenous communities all around the world, they are actually watching this live session because of the technology advancement that being broadcast via live streaming. And it shows our support, especially for the committee that has been prepared this event and agenda, so that even though they are not physically present here, but their support accompanies us personally, as well as those representing the voice of your own benefits and your own circle of environment in your own country. The first one, I'm going to talk about the economic versus the job disruptions. When we talk about the technology itself, we cannot deny that ASEAN countries, especially like Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, with the bonus demography that mentioned just now, we depend more on the manufacturing industries like textiles, electronic, automotive, and the trend nowadays that people are keep on being the trend or the lifestyle is to have electrical vehicles. And all of these things is actually supported by the technology. Automation and AI could displace this job opportunity for the people who are actually working as a blue collars. And despite of these potential job losses, we should focus more on these issues that this bonus demography can actually benefit countries in several ways through technology and also the strategic between business and government. We cannot deny that I'm leading the foundation that focuses on social to make sure that our local indigenous communities know that they have the opportunity to become a social entrepreneur, to become ecopreneur, even though they are still working much harder than the well-established business, but they try their best to be involved in the business sector, but also contribute to the community and society by having and supporting the sustainability aspect. As we know that sustainability, focusing on the three main aspects, social, economy, and environment, and often left behind is the social aspect. I'm coming from a province in East Kalimantan. If you already know that this province is actually the new capital city of Indonesia. But I have to tell you something, that even though we are coming and we are presenting one of the highest GDP in Indonesia, we also face the same issue that maybe all of the ASEAN countries or the Asian face nowadays, that investing in human resource is very low and relatively very slow compared to the advancement of technology and the tangible infrastructure. Those who are joining the previous session talking about just transition, when we talk about transition in technology, it's not as easy as talking about transition in human resource. We need not only about the funding support, but we need the sustainable strategies that the government can support and the business sector can contribute. Undeveloped infrastructure maybe seem crucial, but undeveloped human resource who are living in this world is more crucial. And it leads to my second point, that technological access and inequality is still happening. I repeat, it's still happening. Most of the well-established business sector, I believe they give their best to contribute to the society via or through the CSR program. And I do believe that the local indigenous communities also gain benefits from it. Speaking on behalf of the local indigenous communities, we are not only seeking for the job opportunity, but we require our voice being heard. Rural and indigenous communities in Asia, not only in Indonesia, but also like Philippines, the previous speaker that mentioned just now, and northern eastern India struggle with limited digital access. When we come to a big city and we compare to the city which is not a metropolitan or urban center, it is very different in terms of the human resource. We don't look at the infrastructure, but we look at the human resource. And I believe those developed countries, when they plan for the government strategies, they invest in the human, just before they invest in the technology or even the buildings that we see as a skyscraper. And the third is the environmental impact and sustainability, where Asia has the potential to lead in green technologies. Everyone is speaking about green skills, but I would like to raise a question. Do the sector really prepare for the human resource in green skills? I think everyone can answer that, because as we can see nowadays, the green technology is doing much faster than the human resource that we should invest in the green skills. And what we do in our green startup, in Enable project, we focus on the issue that is least concern, that is about the food waste. How we manage the food waste by using technology, but also give job opportunity to the local communities. Because people who are living outside of the metropolitan city, they have a very different and unique skills that we cannot compare to the people who are working in the city, who are having a high-tech skills, high digital skills, compared to those who doesn't have the opportunity to study and work in a big city. So what they can have is the skills. For example, if you are being raised in a farmer community or family, in a fisherman community or families, that is actually the skills that when the investor come to your province and make the business develop in that provinces, that's the opportunity that government and also business sector and community can work together.
Thanks so much, Ai. You've already alluded a little bit to the circular economy and the role it plays, but I will come back to that question. So companies as duty bearers are starting to take lessons from more traditional industries on the best ways to avoid similar human rights trajectories. So this really means thinking about human rights right at the outset. Ma'am, over to you. How should technology companies ensure that technology design and development aligns with human rights and environmental sustainability?
Okay, so for us as member of B Corp and our commitment to corporate sustainability, we do our own impact assessment. And so we also, in addition to doing the impact assessment and how we operate, so just to clarify, if you're not familiar with Palo IT, we're a small tech consultancy firm. We build digital product solutions for our client. And so for us, it's, yes, doing the impact assessment on when we work on projects with client, but secondary for us is through our own company-wide operation as well. And then thirdly, it's on training of staff. I think it must not be taken for granted that we assume that everyone understands what are the human rights and how it's applied to the technology sector. So in this space, I actually teach my colleagues about sustainable IT and responsible and ethical technology and what this means in their day-to-day role.
Thanks so much, ma'am. You mentioned to me earlier when we were talking that in your organization, most of the people working there are really young.
Yes.
Do you think there is that challenge of sort of understanding how human rights can be incorporated into your work?
I think it's partly an educational thing where, I don't know, in Thailand here, the education background on what are the human rights maybe did not delve deep enough to really explain what it meant beyond the political sense. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and, where there's stereotypical understanding of what are the human rights. For example, recently I did a DEI workshop for my staff training to apply on what does it mean to implement DEI in a tech company. And so this is one example where I could understand that, yes, my staff understands at the broad level what DEI means, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what does it mean for them to apply it on doing UX, UI research to convince a client that there is a better way to check if your digital solution is being inclusive? Are you leaving out any people with disability? Are you checking all the user know-how and experience deep enough to ensure that you're not minimizing anybody's rights? And the thing about digital data security, privacy, that adds on to it as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So the panelists and I agreed that we would pause here after the first round of questions, just to take any burning questions from the floor, if there are any, or before we continue on. So does anyone have any burning questions? Yep, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Here in Thailand, we do a lot on AI development, starting with the concept of AI governance. And actually, we are somewhat relieved and pleased to see that the world is largely aligned in terms of what good AI governance is. And probably the best source of that is the Hiroshima process, which started out from the G7 and may be the single source of getting the best out of AI. So for example, it covers ethical, responsible use of AI, it covers do no harm, human in charge, respect intellectual property rights, be inclusive, don't leave anyone behind, etc. A nice shopping list. Actually, I would like to think it's more than that. Here in Thailand, actually, at the moment, we don't have any AI-specific laws. And we rather think that's a good thing, because if we look at the harms that AI can cause through misuse, there are already pieces of legislation. And with very strong AI governance, it is possible that companies will engage in forming ethical teams to determine the outcomes and the setup of projects before they start. So actually, at a recent Economist Impact Conference late last year, a number of speakers noted this from the corporate sector, that they were doing this. And if you look at the world's research institutes on this, it actually is being done in many ways. Obviously, not everything is being captured, not every harm is being addressed yet. But I'd like to hear from a couple of panel members perhaps on whether there is confidence in the idea of AI governance, or whether people feel suspicious about that, in that it might not address certain things. Thank you.
Can we have your name and your organization?
So I'm sorry. My name is Bob Fox. I'm the chair of the Digital Economy ICT Committee for the Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce. Thank you.
Thank you. And that kind of sort of leads us to the next question as well on AI governance. Thank you for bringing that up. So maybe I can sort of just put that together. Of course, as we know, many governments in Asia and in particularly in ASEAN are already exploring and investing in these major data centers and hubs to meet these ambitions of economic transformation by fostering innovation and promoting knowledge-based approaches. And so to you, Sarayu, how should government, in tandem with the private sector, regulate this space in a way that helps businesses to meaningfully integrate human rights protections and remedies?
Thank you. It's a big and difficult question, but I'll try. If I may take this opportunity to also plug another piece of research that we've collaborated with the UNDP Business Plus Human Rights Program. This is on the implications of generative AI. It specifically looks at gender, but some of what I am going to speak about now will build from both of these papers that we've written on the implications of AI. I'll come to the gentleman's question in a bit, but there are existing broader legal frameworks, both in terms of a global human rights framework, as well as local laws and legislations in different parts of the world that do tackle some of the concerns, risks, and harms that arise out of AI, particularly with respect to indigenous communities. There is the UNDRIP. The UNGPs offer an approach by which to think about this joint responsibility of business and government. And there are, of course, various declarations of various sorts which deal with different aspects of the AI value chain, whether it is materials, whether it is some of the questions around responsibility and safety. There are several frameworks that talk about the question of responsibility in the context of AI. I mean, I have a wish list, I think, more than how I think governments ought to regulate. But I think there are a few principles that would be important to see in the context of AI regulation. I think first, the definitions of responsible AI so far have largely focused on the implications of AI for users, which is that they often deal with concerns of fairness or safety, sometimes about transparency and accountability. But we need to expand that sense of responsibility to include two things. First is labor. Very much of generative AI is built on the labor of people sitting in various parts of the world. Data annotators and labelers, often women, are a very invisible part of the AI economy. Also, AI models, in order to be relevant to smaller communities or lower resource languages, often rely on the labor of indigenous communities to label and annotate data and create rich data sets on which models can learn. So the framing around labor and labor rights is critical to a sense of responsible AI. And equally with this flows environment, there are enormous resource consequences of building and using AI. So assessments of AI should include an assessment of the environmental consequences. The second is, I think, a progressive emphasis on smaller models. There is emerging evidence that smaller models are obviously are less climate intensive. They are also more relevant to context. So an emphasis on smaller models would be relevant in the context of AI as well. The third is, and I think Malaysia has made some progressive statements with respect to the use of cleaner modes of energy use. Using different forms, green energy where relevant, including better hardware, differential pricing for some kinds of AI models might be considered. So this is a third sort of regulatory strategy, and this requires engagement with business as well, because there are consequences on costs. The fourth is, I think, directing or engaging or supporting changes in how models themselves are built. There are emerging techniques in literature that shows that pruning models using techniques like factorizing can help models be more efficient and less energy intensive. So thinking about these forms of changes to the model itself can be significant. I have so many more, so I'm going to go through all of them. I think, particularly from the lens of rights of indigenous communities, participatory modes of AI development is critical. This includes both free and informed consent, as well as legally binding measures for participation of indigenous communities, but also expectation setting around what AI should do. And then the determination of value from the expectations that are set should involve the communities that are affected. And this includes communities that are laboring for AI. This includes communities that are making data for AI. This includes communities whose land, resources are used for the making of AI. So the idea of participatory models of governance should be expansive and truly participatory. I think, of course, there are mandating human rights due diligence as a part of AI processes, and is a critical step that governments can take. The other is also, I think, deeper conversations about questions of responsibility in the context of AI, just given the globally distributed supply chain, the sometimes almost demarcation between who makes and who uses, and what the conflicts of various interests could be in this space. Unpacking the legal framework is also an important step. On the more difficult question of trust and faith in AI governance, several companies have taken progressive steps towards internally governing the making of AI and the use of AI, including, for example, Microsoft has a committee that does oversight on the use and deployment of AI. Several companies have seemingly progressive measures. I think the challenges are twofold. One is that there is a genuine risk of it being self-serving, which is that a company makes a responsible AI framework. It's unlikely that there is necessarily a broader interpretation of what AI is. And second, responsibility frameworks, like I said earlier, have largely focused on the implications of AI use pertaining to safety, fairness, transparency, bias, etc., which are all very valid concerns in the context of AI, but they do not include, for example, the supply chain. So how does, are labor practices certified? Are workers who are labeling data doing so in conditions where they have access to labor rights, and then of course environmental considerations. So the beyond the risks of being potentially limited to a focused interest, they also have very limited view of what responsibility means, and I hope that future discussions on AI governance also include some of these other things. But I'll pause here. It was a long list of things.
That's great. And I think it's good to have that all on record, actually. And Ben, just on the same, to what extent are these international frameworks, such as the UN Guiding Principles or the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, helping to protect communities from harms in the first place, but also to better enable access to remedies?
Yeah, I mean, as we just heard, whether it's for the extractive sector that supplies these industries, or whether it's further up the supply chain itself, the way that AI is being used or designed. Human rights due diligence is a critical step. And I think this example of Kachin gives a really clear painting of why it's not working. These are harms that have been known about for a long time. I mean, rare earth mining was harmful in China known to be harmful in China from 2015. INGOs like Global Witness have done big reports on this since 2022. So companies have known that rare earths in their supply chains are coming from Myanmar, from a conflict zone, and causing these severe harms to indigenous communities for years. But nothing's changed because it's a little bit hard to find a different source. And so they've accepted that as, oh, well, there's not much we can do about it. And now there's no binding consequences for that failure. If we look at what the guidelines, things like OECD and UNGP say, well, if you find yourself directly linked through your supply chain to a harm, you're meant to take steps to mitigate those harms. And if you can't, then eventually disengage. But if you do nothing, if you continue a status quo, eventually you can be seen as contributing to these harms. And then when you're contributing, the step you're meant to take is to provide a remedy. And so, Myanmar now has over 300 rare earth mining sites, 2,700 mining pools with toxic sludge left in them. And so I assume that companies like VW can calculate what proportion of global demand for these minerals they are responsible for. And that is easily trackable to how many watersheds in Myanmar your company has harmed. And so the guiding principles, if you apply them, I think, correctly, should be saying these companies should be providing a remedy. To put it in context, VW's turnover is 325 billion, which is 5 times Myanmar's GDP. And so it's not unreasonable to expect companies of this size to be doing that kind of work. And also, if we look at how companies are still behaving, wind turbines is the other big use of rare earths. And wind turbines can be geared or non-geared. Now, the key thing here is that geared ones use 10 times less rare earths than non-geared wind turbines. And yet, despite there being an option to not use anywhere near as much rare earths, the majority, 2/3 of offshore wind turbines, are still non-geared, and 1/3 of onshore are non-geared. And so companies are still able to make this choice to say, we know these rare earths are coming from Myanmar, but we're going to use them because this is the way we prefer to construct our product. And so solutions, we heard just mentioned in some of the earlier talks, is binding human rights due diligence. And even the laws that we had, the new ones, the CSDDD, which is the German Supply Chain Act, they don't go anywhere close to being far enough because they're providing the potential for administrative fines. That's not saying to communities, well, you've been harmed by our decision, and so you can directly seek some form of remedy or compensation that you have standing to bring those kind of claims. And look, corporations should be able to factor in this kind of compliance, and it needs to be compliance. It can't be voluntary. The corporate sector often finds solutions, whether that's insurance or bonds or binding agreements. And so you can't create any kind of level playing field or say that you're treating indigenous communities or rural communities with any kind of respect if their lands are being destroyed as they're effectively a spectator. And until you give them, or until we create a system that allows people to directly enforce their rights, there is not going to be any access to remedy, and companies aren't going to have to factor in these costs. And in fact, they're going to be penalized often by their shareholders if they do so.
Thanks, Ben. I think you're saying that there needs to be more compliance. So maybe pivoting away from that a little bit, in your own work with your, perhaps your own community in Kalimantan, how can indigenous knowledge systems help to promote business practices that are nature and human rights compatible? What is required really by businesses to translate some of these solutions into durable corporate outcomes, especially for a rapidly evolving sector like digital technologies?
Yeah, I can say that the answer to that question is actually the collaborative multi-stakeholder engagement. Because if we talk about the business itself, it cannot only run by the business owner or those who are involving in the business itself, but it needs the support from the pentahelix collaboration. We need the government, we need the institutions for the research and so on, and we need the media as well. And not to forget that we need the communities who will complete the ecosystem that we need. And talking about the stakeholder engagement, it is very crucial that we need to understand to navigate the challenge posed by the technological race, Asia, or even us as the nations who are living in those countries must prioritize policies that foster inclusive growth. And this includes investing in education and reskilling to help workers, especially the blue collars, to actually understand about the transitions of their skill to emerge with the technology industries. And secondly, we need to bridge the digital divide by improving infrastructure and access to technology in every part in each countries. Because of all the accessibility that we can give equally to all the people who are living in one country, we can make sure that they understand about the priority of the country and also why is the business sector is switching to the green and new technology. What we do in our foundation is that we not only educate and make sure we socialize about the priority of the national priority to make sure that green technology being adapted in our country. We also need the support from the business sector to make sure that the reskilling strategy for the current employees is being done. Make sure that all the people who are doing their job, who earn the living for their family, is also given the opportunity. Not only those young generation who went to university and school to get the updated knowledge, but also to the fathers and mothers who are currently working to be given the equal opportunity. Thirdly, by promoting sustainable practices in industry like agriculture and manufacturing, to ensure that technological progress does not come only at the expense of environmental and social well-being. This is because the sustainability that we mentioned just now, if we look at the agenda, we should actually achieve it by the end of 2030, and we are living in 2025. Maybe those countries who are already a developed country will have smaller gap than the developing countries. But the truth is, there are more countries who need support. And I am here representing not only the indigenous communities, but those voices that are looking for the opportunity to engage for the government support and business sector support. And I am fortunate that in our country, those effort is being made. We are supported by the presidential office itself in order to move the local movement in each of the provinces that we have currently by integrating all the communication between ministries. If it is involving the youth itself, for example, we are talking about environmental issues, then it will involve the Ministry of Environment and also the Ministry of Youth. And I think, and I do believe that everything we do nowadays, it's not only because we see the benefit for ourselves, but when we really work for sustainability, we work for the future. We work for the future generation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ai. I mean, just following up on that, we heard earlier today in the main plenary that ASEAN is putting together, negotiating a declaration on the right to a healthy, sustainable environment. Do you think this will help?
It would be probably a great effort to do that, because rather than doing nothing or doing things on our own. Being collaborative is the key. Collaborative seems to be heard very simple, but I can say that it's hard to make it into a concrete actions. It's very simple to put it on a paper than to prove it in action.
Thanks, Ai. Ma'am, so just to build on this more, what concrete steps can you share and recommend to companies how they should be engaging with local communities and integrating their knowledge into responsible innovation?
Okay, so actually before I answer this, I just wanted to respond to Mr. Bob Fox on the governance. This one is more of my personal opinion. I see that the governance discussion within the AI space is still kind to the sidelines. I think you will have to find champions within this industry that is interested in the space to move forward the responsible and ethical AI development to engage in this, because I think, there is a race on the AI, and a lot of businesses are focusing more on the race and the business outcomes instead of the due diligence and check. So I think, lucky for me, I think our company, our managing director, is open-minded enough to give us, hire me, a human rights person, to join a tech company to think about these serious concerns and move forward in this space. Now, on your point of how we engage communities, I think we do devote a lot of time through practical things within the realm of who we could influence, is one, through our own staff first, then through our clients, and then through our community. So for us here, we actually volunteer to set up what we call the Matcha Initiative in Thailand. It's a brainchild out of Singapore. It's a network of B2B sustainability professional that focuses on accelerating their knowledge gap. For example, sustainability is across 3 dimensions. It requires very different technical expertise that not one sustainability professional could know it all. It's impossible. So if one person has their challenge on, I need to know greenhouse gas accounting, ASAP to do my net zero and decarbonization, who can I go to, where to help? These are the kind of communities we set up, and we meet on a monthly basis, and it's free, all free, but it's B2B guidance and support and community building. And I think expanding on this community to include also representatives from the indigenous community, and I'm happy to say that at Palo we do have indigenous staff as well, and try to reach out to as many different types of stakeholder as much as possible. And we do a lot of tech for good collaborations with nonprofit and other organizations as well. Like the last one we did was with TerraCycle Foundation in Thailand that does a waste management app to help them track the data of all the garbage that they collected from the various canals and how they collect, sort, and manage that data internally for their organizational use, so that they could communicate better with their donors, the different brands that are responsible for the trash. And these are the projects that we do. We're trying to identify these climate tech or responsible tech solutions with our partners, and we need more partners.
No, that's great. And I think, very practical advice is, hire young people and hire indigenous communities.
Yes.
And that's something, companies can really do. That's within the power to do very quickly.
Yes.
I have a lot of questions for the panelists, but again, I want to open it up to the floor so that it's not just me asking questions. We have one here. Go ahead, please introduce yourself and also which organization you're from.
Thank you. I'm Nayabali. I'm a proud transgender woman coming from Pakistan. I really appreciate how panelists describe inclusion and leaving no one behind, and particularly role of communities. We are living in the era of anti-gender movement. There is a systematic array from the mainstream solutions, whether you talk about technology, and the major technology companies are driven by those people who are actively campaigning like the gender is binary. So, but when we come to community, we do acknowledge the roles of indigenous Khwajasra people in Pakistan, Babaylan communities in Philippines, sister girls and brother boys in Australia, and their indigenous knowledge on early global warming and fighting techniques and in related to environments. So, but we just heard, but when we comes to the solutions, we don't include, those companies don't include. The transgender and non-binary people are not addressed. So how panelists see, anyone of you can answer that, how panelists see, like, we can ensure leaving no one behind in the current anti-gender global movement era. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirupati. I think I will take one more question at the back room chat.
Thank you, Jihan. My name is Romsat from Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I have a question related to the AI. So as we know that the energy sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and we also received the report of the human rights implication of the renewable energy in the region, whether it's the land grabbings or the critical minerals minings. So how can we balance the benefit of AI with the need to reduce the high energy consumption? Because as we know, AI need a lot of energy for the training and deploy of the AI or the cooling system for the data hubs. How can we balance these two contradictory needs? Thank you.
Thanks, Ramchat. Do you want to direct your question to anyone on the panel? No? Okay, open. And another question, I think I saw a hand. Nope. Okay, I think we'll take those two questions. Any volunteers?
I could try.
Yeah.
Okay, so first I'll respond to you about the transgender and the. I think it's unfortunate, having grown up in the U.S. as well, that the issue of transgender and LGBTQ rights has become a political mess, a problem. And unfortunately, the tech companies right now in the United States are aligning with the new current power in power, the government in power. So I think for us, though, what we can do is right after, the big tech companies recalled back their DEI efforts and all these protection measures, I just had our 2 DEI workshops in Thailand for my staff to drive home the point again that for our company, despite what our major tech partners are saying, we do not agree. And for us, we focus on what we can control. And for us here in Thailand, for our staff and our partners, this is our DEI policy. This is what it means. It applies across, it doesn't matter what gender or sexual orientation you are. We are focused on doing tech for good and the positive impact that comes from that. And then for the question on the human rights due diligence, I think this one for the company, I think you have to separate out also the people responsible for making the AI and the people, the tech companies that maybe use the AI, and the government agenda, also political agenda that goes into the investment. But it goes back to human rights due diligence, right? Are the companies involved in the whole AI chain doing their human rights due diligence? And are they being upfront with their own accountability of what role they play in minimizing the risks and the violations? I think that's the best starting point.
Thanks so much, ma'am. Anyone else want to maybe have comments? Ben?
Yeah, just to very quickly add to that last point is that, yeah, very much agree, and human rights due diligence needs to be compulsory. Again, it's companies aren't going to do it voluntarily. It's a cost.
Thanks, Ben. There are no other questions. I have a question, and I want to ask Ayi this. So you work in the space of circularity and the circular economy. E-waste, represents the world's fastest growing waste stream, and it's often shipped to developing countries, especially in Asia. So maybe reflecting on your own work at the Enable project, are there any principles of circularity that could help companies access some of these unrealized opportunities that reduce environmental harm and also have negative human rights impacts?
I think that's a great question because currently we are doing a research and also transforming knowledge about waste nowadays. It's not only focused on plastic waste, but there's a lot of waste that is actually happen around us. And one of them is e-waste. I do believe that especially people who are living nowadays in an advanced technological era have more than one device. Maybe we have more than 2 smartphones, and then we have laptop and other devices. And somehow, most of the people who are living in this advanced era, they doesn't know that the waste that actually comes from the device is very harmful, just as harmful as the plastic waste that we can see a lot of campaign, a lot of activists is speaking on behalf of the plastic waste. When we talk about e-waste itself, it comes to talking about health and environmental risks. As we, the nation, lives in the ASEAN countries, we face a lot of changes, especially investment in terms of the technology, where those people who are coming from medium to high income families have more than 1 car in one family. And then what we need to do is that we need to make sure that they understand their responsibility as a consumer. So when we talk about circular economy, it concerns about the consumer behavior. And when it talks about consumer behavior, it relates to the responsibility of an individual. And that's what we are focusing on. Educating people and do socialization regarding on responsible consumption and production, which leads to the SDGs numbers 12. It's not a short-term strategy, but a long-term strategy. Not to mention that the big and well-established company for F&B itself, they are moving and switching to educate the consumer. In order to buy their products, there are some ethical consideration in terms of the business aspect. And I agree that those companies who are working in the technological sector also need to enforce the regulations and the ethical considerations for the consumer itself. And thirdly, promoting environmental justice through circularity. Not every people are familiar with the term circular economy. There's a lot of terms coming in this advanced era. Sustainability, greenhouse effect, impact, circular economy, mention every one of them. But if we come to talk about the local indigenous communities and how we can support it, education is the key, and continuous socializations should be the strategy to all the business sector. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ai. I have another question for you, Ben. So slaps. Slaps are commonly used not really as a last resort and oftentimes as a first line of defense for companies and against communities seeking justice or remedies. So anti-slap strategies, I think, are thus, an important feature of indigenous resistance against really well-resourced entities. Do you have any examples that you could share of innovative legal tools or mechanisms that can be replicated across the region for communities to build resilience against slaps?
Yeah, and it's interesting because according to the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, mining companies from 2015 to 2021 were the most likely organisation to start a slap suit. And being here in Thailand is a good place to be talking about this. It's regionally a real issue in Thailand, a large number of slap suits. An example of a case that I was linked to was a journalist that reported on a mining company. It was a Myanmar mining company operating in Myanmar that caused significant harms to communities and was eventually found liable in the Myanmar courts for environmental damages. A Thai journalist reported on that, and because of that reporting, the company sued him. This is the Myanmar Pongpipat company, at least three separate times in Thailand. It took 6 years for the last of those cases before it was dismissed. And so really, I think for a lot of communities and activists, you could say that SLAP it's a cost of doing business. It's if you raise your voice, you can expect to face some kind of lawsuit like this. There are some things that are possible to do. I think sort of know your rights training is something that is particularly important. It gives communities a better understanding of what their rights are, what they can say, what their free speech rights are within the legal system that they find themselves in. It also helps people assess what they can say more safely and how much risk appetite they have for raising grievances against corporations. There's also a massive need for pro bono legal defense, but this is a resource, and this is the whole point of SLAP, is it takes up people's time and resources. And so lots of environmental lawyers, environmental defenders, human rights lawyers that could be doing other work for communities find themselves doing SLAP suits, and without these lawyers, communities would often find themselves having to either be silent or go to prison. And so I think that leaves us with law reform being the main solution. There's been some of that in Thailand. In 2018, the Criminal Procedure Code was amended to include ways that the court could dismiss cases where there was harassment or undue advantage being sought, or you could raise a lack of merit in preliminary hearings. But these have rarely been used in Thailand. I think judicial or training of judges is a massive need to try and make sure those provisions are used, and to have better laws. And that is part of the Thai National Action Plan, both the first one and the revised one, and the law is currently being considered. But I think when we look at these anti-SLAP laws, you need to have provisions where cases can be dismissed early, so the communities can apply to have a case dismissed at the very outset, rather than it dragging on for years. Because the whole point of a SLAP is it has no real basis, it's just to use up people's time and resources. That there should be cost recovery, so that people can recover their costs for defending these cases, and then additional penalties, that if you bring a pointless lawsuit simply to silence people, you find yourself on the end of a fine as well. And then other things like reforming overly broad laws that can be used very easily, and perhaps, say, having mandatory grievance mechanisms in that rather than bring a lawsuit, you have to first go through a compulsory grievance process. So yeah, but I think law reform is the key. Otherwise, the main thing is it just takes up people's time, and that's the whole point of them.
Thanks so much, Ben. Sorry, back to you. Are there examples from your own work of corporate indigenous partnerships that have successfully resolved conflicts?
Yes, so there are instances globally, not necessarily in the context of AI. The Indigenous Guardians Program in Canada, there were some of the examples cited by other panelists in the earlier session, etc. But I was hoping to dwell on an example that we worked on. It isn't so much Indigenous communities, but we worked with Uber, ride-hail company, to build their driver advisory council. Now there's writing on it, and happy to share it as well, but what the driver advisory council was a way to bring drivers from across the country to participate in a governance model alongside Uber, and they've been fairly instrumental in driving a few types of changes. First, better products and services. Second, more access to facilities and sort of better working conditions in the course of work. And this was significant because this was the first time a company in the ride-hail space had reached out to actually do this. Now, we were a third-party mediator in that we acted as the entity that was responsible for instituting the council and then helping run it over the course of 2 years. And we had meetings every quarter and smaller meetings over the course of the 2 years as well, outside of those formal settings. I think there's a few reasons why it worked. One is that it was initiated by the company themselves. And I say worked with all the cautions, of course, and happy to have a longer discussion offline as well, but it was initiated by the company. So there was interest in thinking about different ways of engaging with communities of people who work on platforms. This second is that it was third-party mediated, which is that we played a significant role in not just ensuring the substantive processes, which is what was being discussed, what were the themes, what were sort of action points that emerged, how were they navigated, etc. But we also played a big role in the procedural aspects of making it a fair space, which is critical in thinking about the participation of indigenous communities, but in this particular instance, workers who worked on ride-hail platforms. So this is an example of how technology governance with the role of a community can work. But for it to truly be something meaningful, I think legal recognition of these kinds of entities, definitions of both what substantive processes consist of and procedural aspects look like is necessary. I think also the broader conversation around the digital divide, or sort of, there's the habitus of participating in certain kinds of spaces needs to be tackled head on. But ultimately, here is an example of how in the contemporary world, in the context of an algorithmic mediation of work, governance could work. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Sarayu. And ma'am, just to kind of sort of finish us off, how does Paulo IT contribute to making technology more sustainable and inclusive in Asia?
I think for this one, I'll just share an experience. We had a client, a big corporate conglomerate, that wanted to see on a potential prototype for a tourism app that focused on low carbon tourism app. And they hired us because of our sustainability expertise and the UX UI team design on research, to validate with the local community that they aim to pilot this in, if it was feasible. So for us, our team went down to the local community and talked to every representative from the tourism industry to confirm with them that the local plans for responsible and sustainable tourism is, what are your key challenges, what are your pain points, and if there was a sustainable tourism or low carbon travel tourism app, would they be interested to partner, use the prototype? What would they like out of it? And in the end, it turned out that it did not align. The local community was very proactive already on implementing responsible/sustainable tourism. They had very key, clear goal agendas at the local level, what they want. So for us, we had to relay this back to our corporate client and say, your focus on just the low carbon travel is too narrow for the local community. They wanted to include the social component, the economic benefits shared distribution model to the local businesses as well. So then it gave our client, okay, we better go back and do our more planning due diligence. So I think this integrated stakeholder engagement into the delivery process is important.
Very nice. So I think we're 10 minutes away from the end. Perhaps to just close off the session, I have one last question for all the panelists, and perhaps your final message as well. What is one thing that businesses can do tomorrow to integrate indigenous and local community voices in their agendas? And I will start on my right with Sarayu. Bonus question.
I think one thing that they can do tomorrow is, and I speak from the limited context of working with some types of companies, is start with educating themselves about where their work intersects with indigenous communities in the first place. And some sense of responsibility, to my mind, comes from awareness, which again, is a distributed capacity very unevenly. Smaller companies do not necessarily sometimes even consider or have this space. So educate, learn, educate yourselves, yeah, to start with.
I think there's this huge difference between how businesses treat each other and how they treat communities. That businesses, when they want to go into business with other companies, they don't trust each other. Fundamentally, they enter binding agreements. They have that expectation that while they have some shared interest, they want a binding agreement that gives them a way to enforce contracts or gives them insurance or some kind of mechanism for when things don't go as they hoped. But then they expect communities to be just consulted and perhaps raise a voluntary grievance. So I think starting to treat communities as an actual stakeholder on an equal footing would be a good start.
Very good. Thank you, Ben. Ai?
I met a lot of impactful leaders, and most of them is the one who actually have the responsibility as an individual to lead the communities. Whether we come from the background as a government, as an indigenous, as a business sector, we are all part of the big communities in this world. And what I can say is that policy-making decision involve all of us without leaving no one behind. And that's what we can fight for. And all the benefits that we gain is actually the mutual benefit that we can create with each other.
Thank you, Ai. And finally, ma'am.
I think for us, we're always on the lookout to collaborate on some interesting innovation or using tech to utilize how to help Indigenous community. I think if an opportunity comes up in a line, we would like to potentially collaborate.
That's great.